The rain had not stopped over Ashford City for 3 days, but inside St. Agnes Memorial Hospital, the air was dry and sterile, humming with fluorescent light and quiet suffering. It was the kind of night where the world outside felt far away, and the only thing that mattered was the next patient, the next chart, the next breath. Dr. Lena Brooks moved through the maternity ward with the practiced calm of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that panic helps no one. She was 7 months pregnant herself, her scrubs stretched gently over her belly, her feet swollen from a 12-hour shift that had already run 2 hours over. She rubbed the small of her back as she walked, smiling at a young mother cradling a newborn, checking vitals on a monitor, signing off on a chart with the quick, sure hand of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. She loved her work. She loved it the way some people love a person, completely, and without needing a reason. She did not know that in 11 minutes, her whole life was going to fracture in front of the world. Victor Kane arrived at St. Agnes the way he arrived everywhere, like the building itself owed him something. He stepped out of a black Bentley that had been double parked in the ambulance bay, an act so casual, so unthinking, that even the valet who tried to stop him simply stepped aside. Victor Kane did not walk into rooms. He entered them, the way a storm enters a coastline, indifferent to what it destroys. He was 38 years old, worth roughly $4 billion, and the CEO of Kane Dynamics, a private aerospace and defense contractor that had made his family obscenely wealthy for 2 generations. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, and a watch that cost more than most people's houses. His face, when photographed for magazine covers, was often described as chiseled and commanding. Tonight, under hospital lighting, it just looked cold. He was here because his father, Harold Kane, had suffered chest pains an hour earlier at a private dinner. The old man was stable now, resting in a private suite 2 floors up, but Victor had marched down to the emergency wing anyway, furious that no one had briefed him properly, determined to find someone to blame for the 20 minutes he'd spent in a waiting room like an ordinary person. He found Lena at the nurse's station. "I need someone to explain to me," he said, his voice carrying down the hallway, "why the hell it took 40 minutes to get my father a private room." Lena looked up from her chart, unbothered. She had dealt with men like this before, men who mistook money for authority, and authority for the right to be cruel. "Sir, your father is stable, and he's being cared for by our cardiac team. If you have questions about his care, I can page his attending physician." "I don't want his physician. I want an explanation for why this hospital treats a $4 billion donor's family like they're standing in line at the DMV. A small, humorless laugh escaped Lena before she could stop it. "We treat everyone the same here. That's actually the point of a hospital." Something flickered across Victor's face, the particular fury of a man who had never once, in his adult life, been spoken to like an equal. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Kane," Lena said evenly. "I read the file. I also have 4 other patients tonight who don't have $4 billion, and they get the same standard of care your father is getting. Now, if you'll excuse me." She turned to walk away. He grabbed her arm. It wasn't hard. It didn't need to be. It was the shock of it, the sheer, casual entitlement of it, that made 3 nurses nearby freeze mid-step. "I am talking to you," Victor said, low and venomous. Lena turned back, her eyes steady, despite the tremor of adrenaline now running through her. "Let go of my arm." "Or what?" And that was the moment, the exact, irreversible moment, when Victor Kane's hand came up and struck her across the face. The sound was small. A slap doesn't sound like much. Not really, not the way it does in movies. But in that hallway, in that silence, it sounded like the world cracking in half. Lena staggered back a step, one hand flying instinctively to her belly, the other to her stinging cheek. For a moment, nobody moved. A monitor beeped somewhere down the hall. Somebody's oxygen machine hissed. And Victor Kane stood there, breathing hard, something like satisfaction flickering behind his eyes. The satisfaction of a man who believed he had simply reasserted the natural order of things. "That's what happens," he said quietly, "when you forget who you're talking to." That was when the elevator doors opened. Marcus Brooks did not look like a man who ran into hospitals often. He wore a gray overcoat over a dark suit, an FBI credential clipped to his belt, and the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent 2 decades learning to read a room in under 3 seconds. He'd gotten the call 20 minutes earlier. His sister, in labor scare, minor complication, nothing serious, just come when you can. And he had broken every speed limit between the federal building and St. Agnes to get here. He stepped off the elevator in time to see his sister's hand pressed to her reddened cheek, her eyes wide with shock, and a man in an expensive suit standing over her with the residual arrogance of someone who thought he'd won something. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was low and absolutely still. The stillness of a man who had spent his career learning that real power doesn't raise its voice. "You just slapped my sister." Victor turned, and for a fraction of a second, something in his gut told him to be afraid. He ignored it, the way he ignored every instinct that didn't serve his ego. "And who exactly are you?" Marcus stepped forward, close enough that Victor could see the federal badge clearly now, gold and unmistakable. "Marcus Brooks, Special Agent in Charge, FBI Ashford Field Office." A pause, deliberate, surgical. "And that woman you just hit is Dr. Lena Brooks, my sister, 7 months pregnant. Which means, Mr. Kane," he said the name like it tasted bad, "you just committed felony assault on a pregnant woman, in a hospital, in front of 6 witnesses, one of whom happens to run federal law enforcement for this entire city." Victor laughed. It was an ugly, disbelieving sound, the laugh of a man who had never once faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. "Do you know what my lawyers will do to you people by morning? Do you know," Marcus said, stepping even closer, "what I'm going to do to you?" The grin on Victor's face did not vanish immediately, but it began, in that instant, to die, slowly, the way a light dims before it goes out completely, flickering with a confidence that was no longer quite real. If you're new here, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to Love and Tension so you don't miss what happens next. The next 72 hours were, for Victor Kane, an education in humiliation. His lawyers arrived within the hour, 3 of them, sharp-suited and expensive, murmuring about de-escalation and optics and making this go away quietly. But there was a problem they hadn't accounted for. The hospital's hallway cameras had captured everything, in crisp, unforgiving high definition, and Marcus Brooks had already secured the footage before Victor's legal team had finished parking. By morning, it was everywhere. Not because Marcus leaked it, he was too careful for that, too precise, but because one of the nurses who had watched it happen couldn't stay silent, and she had a phone, and the internet doesn't need permission to be furious. Billionaire CO caught on camera slapping pregnant nurse. Victim is sister of FBI director. The headline detonated across every platform within 6 hours. Kane Dynamics stock dropped 4% before the markets even opened properly. Board members who had spent years quietly tolerating Victor's temper suddenly found their voices. Reporters camped outside the Kane Tower. A boycott hashtag trended by noon. Victor sat in his glass-walled office on the 40th floor, staring down at the city like it had personally betrayed him. "This will blow over," he told his father, who had been discharged and now sat across from him, pale and unusually quiet. "It always blows over." Harold Kane said nothing. His silence had a texture to it that Victor didn't like, heavier than exhaustion, closer to guilt. "Dad, you should apologize," Harold said finally, publicly, sincerely, "before this becomes something you can't control." I'm not apologizing to some nurse who couldn't do her job fast enough." Harold's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something old and frightened passed behind his eyes. "Victor, you don't understand what you've started. What is that supposed to mean?" But Harold only shook his head and looked away, and Victor, arrogant, furious, utterly unaware, didn't push. He should have. It would have saved him 3 days. Marcus Brooks did not believe in coincidences. 20 years in federal law enforcement had taught him that the universe rarely hands you a clean villain without a history attached, and something about Victor Kane's reaction in that hallway, not just the cruelty, but the ease of it, the total absence of hesitation, nagged at him like a splinter. So while the media handled Victor's public humiliation, Marcus quietly opened a different kind of investigation. Not about the slap, about the Kane family itself. He started with Kane Dynamics Charitable Foundation, the one that, ironically, funded a wing of St. Agnes Memorial. 25 years of donation records, board minutes, hospital affiliations. It was tedious work, the kind most people would have delegated. Marcus did it himself, on his living room table, coffee going cold beside him, because some instinct told him this needed his own eyes. 3 nights in, he found it. A settlement. Sealed, 25 years old, buried under 3 layers of shell company legal language, designed specifically to never surface. A malpractice case at St. Agnes, involving a delivery room death. A mother and infant, both lost, in a case that should have triggered a state investigation, and somehow never did. The settlement had been paid not by the hospital, but by a private trust connected to a name Marcus almost didn't believe when he first saw it. Eleanor Kane, Victor's mother. Deceased 8 years now, but very much alive in this file. Signing checks, silencing witnesses, making a tragedy disappear as quietly as spilled water. Marcus sat back in his chair, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. The mother who had died in that delivery room, the case Eleanor Kane had buried. Her name was Adaeze Brooks, Marcus's own mother. His hands were shaking now, and it took him a full minute to understand why. He'd grown up being told his mother died of complications during his sister Lena's birth. A tragedy, yes, but a natural one. Nobody's fault, just the cruelty of biology. He had believed that his entire life. Lena had believed it too. It was the quiet grief they had both carried, the wound that had, in some strange way, made them close. 2 siblings who had lost a mother neither of them really got to know, bonded by an absence. But the documents in front of him told a different story. A story about a hospital that had made a fatal, negligent error, a misdiagnosed complication, a delayed intervention, a preventable death, and a wealthy family that had paid an enormous sum under a mountain of legal silence to make sure no one ever had to answer for it. Eleanor Kane hadn't just failed to help. She had made the truth disappear, and her son had grown up in the empire that truth had bought. When Marcus told Lena, she didn't cry right away. She sat very still in her apartment, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, and stared at the documents spread across her coffee table like they belonged to someone else's life. "Our mother," she said slowly, "didn't die because of bad luck." "No," Marcus said. "She died because a hospital made a mistake, and a rich woman decided it would be cheaper to bury the truth than admit it." Lena's eyes lifted to his. "And her son just slapped me in the same hospital. 25 years later." Neither of them said the word out loud, but it sat there between them anyway, heavy and undeniable. Irony. Or maybe it wasn't irony at all. Maybe it was something closer to inheritance, the way cruelty, left unexamined, doesn't disappear. It just waits for the next generation to pick it back up. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked quietly. Lena looked down at the file, at her mother's name typed in cold, bureaucratic font, reduced to a line item in a settlement no one was ever supposed to see. "I want him to know," she said. "Not the world, not yet. I want him to know exactly what his family did. I want him to carry it the way we've carried it our whole lives, not knowing. Victor Kane's public apology was, by any objective measure, a disaster. His PR team had scripted it carefully, remorseful language, a promise of personal growth, a donation to a maternal health nonprofit timed for maximum media softness. But when he stood at the podium 3 days after the slap, cameras flashing, Lena Brooks sitting in the front row at Marcus's quiet insistence, Victor could not make himself sound sorry. He sounded, instead, like a man reading a hostage note written by someone else, technically compliant, emotionally absent. "I regret the incident," he said, "and I've agreed to undergo sensitivity training and to make a significant donation." "Do you regret hitting her?" a reporter called out. "Or do you regret getting caught?" Victor's jaw tightened. For one unscripted second, the mask slipped, and the real Victor Kane, the one who had never in his life believed he owed anyone an explanation, flashed through. "I regret," he said coldly, "that this hospital employs staff who can't recognize an emergency situation involving a major donor's family." The room went silent. Somewhere near the back, someone actually gasped. Lena, sitting perfectly still in the front row, felt something in her chest settle. Not anger exactly, but a kind of grim clarity. This man had learned nothing. He would learn. Marcus, standing just off to the side in an unmarked navy suit, met Victor's eyes across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He simply held up a folder, thin, unremarkable, utterly devastating, and watched Victor's confidence flicker like a candle in a draft. He requested the meeting himself, 3 days later. Not his lawyers, him. Marcus agreed. On one condition: Lena would be present. They met in a small, windowless conference room at the FBI field office. No cameras, no assistants, no audience for Victor to perform for. Just the three of them, a table, and a folder that Marcus slid across the surface without a word. Victor opened it like a man opening a letter he already suspected would ruin him. He read the settlement agreement first, then the internal hospital memo. Then, last, a photograph, grainy, decades old, of a young black woman in a hospital bed, smiling faintly at a newborn boy in her arms. Adaeze Brooks. Marcus, an hour old, oblivious to the tragedy about to unfold around him. "That's not possible," Victor said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "My mother ran a foundation. She funded that hospital's maternity wing. She funded it," Lena said quietly, "with the exact settlement she paid to keep our mother's death quiet. Read the dates, Victor. The malpractice payout and the donation happened 11 days apart. She didn't build that wing out of generosity. She built it to bury what she did." Victor stared at the photograph. Something in his chest, some load-bearing wall he hadn't known was there, began, very slowly, to crack. "I didn't know," he said, and it was the first honest sentence he'd spoken since the slap. "No," Marcus said, "you didn't, but you slapped a pregnant black woman in the same hospital your mother paid to silence, over a delay you decided was worth violence. You didn't know the history, but you didn't need to. The cruelty was already in you. It didn't come from nowhere, Victor. It came from her." That should have been the end of it. A private reckoning, a quiet unraveling, the kind of justice that doesn't make headlines but changes a man from the inside. But Victor Kane had spent 38 years building a life on the belief that money could resolve anything, and old habits, especially arrogant ones, do not die from a single conversation. He came to Lena's apartment 2 nights later, alone. No bodyguards, no lawyers. She almost didn't let him in. She did, mostly out of curiosity, about what a cornered man like Victor Kane looked like when the cameras weren't watching. He was carrying a briefcase. "I want to make this right," he said, setting it on her kitchen counter and opening it to reveal stacks of paper, a wire transfer authorization, pre-signed, for an amount so large Lena had to read it twice to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding the zeros. $5 million, Victor said. "For you. For the baby. For everything my family took from yours, I'll set up a trust. I'll do it quietly. No press, no conditions. Just, he exhaled, and for a moment, something almost human flickered across his face. Just let this be over. Lena looked at the money for a long moment. Then she closed the briefcase, gently, and slid it back across the counter toward him. Your money can't buy back what your family took from mine, she said. You can't pay someone to unhappen a death, and you definitely can't pay me to pretend a slap never landed on my face. Then what do you want? Victor's voice cracked, just slightly, the frustration of a man discovering that some doors don't open no matter how hard you push money against them. Tell me what you want, and I'll do it. I don't want anything from you, Victor. Lena's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. That's the part you can't understand. You've spent your whole life thinking every problem has a price tag. My mother's death didn't. My son's father not being in his life doesn't. And what you did to me in that hallway doesn't either. Some things you don't get to buy your way out of. You just have to live with them. She walked to her front door and opened it, a silent, dignified invitation for him to leave. Victor didn't move for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, My mother used to say something like that. When I was a kid, some things you don't buy, Victor. You just survive them. He looked up, and something raw and unguarded passed over his face. I always thought she meant it about other people's problems, never about hers. He left without the briefcase. The unraveling, when it finally came, did not look like a scandal. It looked like a man slowly disappearing inside his own house. Victor stopped sleeping properly. He would wake at 3 in the morning, convinced he'd heard a slap echo somewhere in his penthouse, though there was never anyone there. He started avoiding mirrors, not consciously, not at first, but he noticed, with a kind of detached horror, that he'd covered the one in his private elevator with a jacket, that he'd stopped using the bathroom with the full-length mirror in his bedroom, that he showered now with his eyes fixed on the tile, because when he did look, he no longer saw himself. He saw his mother. The resemblance had always been there, the sharp jaw, the pale eyes, the particular way both of them tilted their chin up when they wanted to intimidate someone smaller than themselves. He'd never noticed it before, because he'd never had a reason to look for cruelty in his own reflection. Now he couldn't stop finding it. He started digging through his mother's old files himself, not for exoneration, but almost as if some part of him needed to confirm the full weight of what he'd inherited. He found more than the one settlement. There were others, smaller, older, spanning back decades. A pattern, not an incident. His mother had spent her adult life quietly erasing the consequences of the empire's carelessness, one silenced family at a time. And Victor had grown up inside the wing of a hospital built entirely from other people's unspoken grief. His father, when confronted, only confirmed it with a weary, defeated nod. I told her to stop, Harold said, his voice thin with the exhaustion of decades of complicity. I told her every single time. She always said the same thing. It's just business, Harold. People move on. He looked at his son with something close to pity. You sound just like her, you know. When you talk about the nurses. The inconvenience of ordinary people. I heard your mother's voice come out of your mouth, and I didn't say anything, because by then it was easier not to. Why didn't you tell me? Victor's voice cracked, the anger draining out of it, leaving only something smaller and more frightened underneath. Because I built my whole life pretending it wasn't real, Harold said. And so did you. That's the family business, Victor. We don't inherit money. We inherit denial. Kane Dynamics Board convened an emergency session 11 days after the slap. Victor sat at the head of the table out of habit, though the seat no longer felt like his. The vote, when it came, was unanimous and merciless. He was to step down as CEO, effective immediately, pending an independent review of the foundation's donation history. A review Marcus Brooks's office had quietly, legally, ensured would happen. Victor didn't fight it. That was the strangest part, even to himself. The man who had once fought a parking valet over 10 feet of ambulance bay space now signed his own resignation letter with something close to relief, as if putting down a weight he'd been carrying his entire life without realizing how heavy it was. The press called it a fall from grace. Victor knew better. It wasn't a fall. It was an unveiling. The grace had never really been there. Just money, dressed up convincingly enough that everyone, including him, had mistaken it for character. Before we get to how this story ends, if you're enjoying it so far, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Love and Tension so you catch the next one. 3 months passed. Lena gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a quiet Tuesday morning, with Marcus pacing the hallway outside exactly the way their mother's family had once paced a different hallway, in a different decade, waiting for news that never came. This time, the news was good. Lena named her daughter Adaize, after the grandmother she'd never gotten the chance to meet, and for the first time since the slap, something in the Brooks family felt, if not fully healed, at least honestly held. Lena did not return to St. Agnes Memorial. She didn't need to make a statement about it. She simply transferred to a community clinic across town, one with no marble donor plaques bearing anyone's name, one built on nothing but ordinary, unremarkable good work. It felt, she told Marcus, like breathing outside for the first time after years in a sealed room. Victor Kane, meanwhile, retreated from public life almost entirely. He sold the penthouse. He resigned from every board he'd ever sat on. He gave away, quietly and without press releases, a significant portion of his personal fortune to maternal health initiatives in cities his family's foundation had never touched. Not as penance exactly, because he'd learned by now that penance implies an ending, a moment where the debt is paid and the guilt lifts. This didn't lift. It just became part of how he carried himself through the world. Smaller, quieter, perpetually aware of the weight of a name he could no longer separate from what it had cost other people. He never spoke to Lena again. He tried, once. A letter, handwritten, unsent, found later crumpled in a drawer by an assistant clearing out his old office. It said, in part, that he understood now what his mother had meant about surviving things, instead of buying your way out of them, and that he was sorry, not for the cameras, not for the board, but because he finally, fully understood what the word meant. He never mailed it. Some things he'd learned, you don't get to resolve, you just live inside them. On the 1-year anniversary of the slap, a reporter tracked Victor down to a modest apartment 2 hours outside the city. A stunning fall for a man who had once owned 3 private jets. She asked him, gently, whether he had any regrets. Victor was quiet for a long moment, staring somewhere past the camera, past the reporter, past the version of himself that used to fill rooms without asking permission. I used to think strength meant never apologizing, he said finally. Now I think it means living every day with something you can't undo, and not pretending it isn't there. He paused. I looked in a mirror for 38 years and only ever saw myself. It took one slap for me to finally see my mother standing behind me the whole time. I don't know if that's a redemption story. I don't think it is. I think it's just the truth. Finally, after 25 years of my family paying people to bury it. The interview never aired in full. The network cut it down to 90 seconds for a segment on corporate accountability, stripped of everything that made it feel human. But somewhere, in an editing room nobody paid attention to, an assistant producer watched the raw, unedited footage twice and felt an unexpected chill crawl up her spine at the final shot before the tape cut off. Victor Kane, alone in a small apartment, glancing instinctively toward a mirror on the wall, and then, just as quickly, looking away. Because whatever he saw there, he still couldn't bear to look at it for long. And somewhere across the city, Lena Brooks tucked her daughter into a crib in a modest, sunlit apartment, unaware and uninterested in whatever Victor Kane was doing with the rest of his broken life. She had already gotten what she needed, not an apology, not a settlement, not even justice in any traditional sense. She had gotten the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was its own kind of ending, not happy, not resolved, but real. The kind that doesn't tie itself up in a bow, because some wounds are never meant to close all the way. They're only meant to be seen. The end.